We're almost there, hockey heads. Another day closer to puck drop on the upcoming season, which means we're getting very serious on the Wednesday episode of the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. Big time special guest Michael Amato is here to break down all the targets and players you need to fade. Jeremy Swayman, Filip Gustavsson, Troy Terry, and all the arbitration news you need. Thank you for joining us. Let's get this paper.
You're Locked On Fantasy Hockey, your daily podcast on fantasy hockey. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, everybody? And happy hump day. Another day of the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. Off-season coverage continues with a big-time episode. Thank you for making us your first listen every single day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. On today's episode, hopefully you're seeing it there on the graphic on YouTube. If not, make sure you head over to the channel and subscribe. Filip Gustavsson, Jeremy Swayman, not so much Troy Terry because we're waiting for the news there still. But there are some major arbitration settlements already happening, and I think this means big-time things for fantasy goaltending markets. We'll break it down on today's episode, and of course, we're joined by fantasy guru, goaltender specialist, Mr. Michael Amato of Sportsnet.ca to break it all down. Steele, I'm so hyped to have him on. This is so timely. Players to target, players to fade, and we'll pick his brain on those topics I just mentioned. I'm so excited to have Amato back on the show today.
Well, he is the goalie expert for a reason, and we got two goalies to talk about, Filip Gustavsson and Jeremy Swayman, two young goaltenders, very promising goaltenders for that fact, in the NHL. So obviously it's great to have Michael Amato on every single time we can get him onto the podcast, and thank you guys so much for tuning in every single day. Remember, we are shortened down in August. Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays, 3 times a week is when you can find our episodes. Let's get Michael Amato on for today's episode.
And we are joined by the fantasy guru, Sportsnet.ca, and of course, goalie post managing editor, Mr. Michael Amato. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. This is a special time in the fantasy realm because GMs that are dedicated to getting this money are already digging into the trenches, players to watch, players to fade. They're all over the news that's breaking, and that's where we want to start with today's episode. But first of all, how are you doing? And thank you so much for joining us.
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Now that the pleasantries are over, we're keeping it short and sweet there. Filip Gustavsson, this is a player that we're going to have to dive into because it's clear to me, and I think to everyone here, the crease is his in Minnesota, and this is a good defensive team. Last year, I believe they were in, top 7, top 8 on goals against per game. What's your take on this signing and his overall fantasy value headed into next season?
So I think Gustafsson's going to be a really good goalie to roster, obviously, next year. I think you might see him a little bit lower in some rankings than you might think, just because, I do think he's probably the 1A now. But if you sort of look back to the end of last season, I think like Fleury actually finished pretty strong, and they still split starts quite regularly, even in that playoff series against Dallas. I think Fleury got like a couple of games in there. So like I'm not entirely convinced Gustafsson's going to give you like 55 to 60 games. I think he might be closer to like 45 to 50. But obviously if he has the numbers he had last year, that's still pretty incredible value. And definitely a guy you're going to want to have around, even if he is only playing that amount of games, because his numbers were phenomenal. So let's see if he can keep that up. I think the one thing that makes me pause slightly on him is just how good will the Wild be again this year? I think one of the things to watch is they've got that massive dead cap penalty that's really kicking in this year for Suter and Parise. I think it's almost like 15 million. So I wonder, how teams can compete having that much money kind of basically in dead cap, and, are they going to be able to add anybody significant or kind of keep up with the other teams in the league that are adding. So I don't expect them to be a bad team. I just wonder like if they're going to take a slight step back. Again, I don't think that would like dissuade me from taking Gustafsson, but I think I would just sort of keep that in the back of my mind when I'm drafting.
Yeah, I think so too as well. I think they're going to be pretty much the same as last year. I like the pieces they've added so far. Patrick Maroon adding some more grittiness on that blue line in the apps, obviously with Ryan Reeves leaving as well. I think their blue line's pretty solid as well. Brock Faber, coming into into next season, Kalen Addison, maybe not a ton of fantasy value with those two players, but as young rookies on the blue line, under Jared Spurgeon, under Jonas Brodin, and they can learn a lot as well. And then, I think I agree with everything you just said about Filip Gustavsson. I think he is the 1A goalie here, probably going to get 45, hopefully 50, 52 games on the high end. But Mark, to have a backup goaltender or have a mentor like Marc-Andre Fleury at 25 years old and finally getting that 1A goalie starting position is going to be huge for him. And I think this is huge for the Minnesota Wild too, because this gives more time for Jesper Wallstedt as well to work his way up into the lineup over the next couple of years as well. So I love the deal from him. They avoid arbitration, obviously. And, I'm a huge Minnesota Wild fan, so I'm going to stick with them.
Just let it out, Steele.
I'm going to stick with them being a top 3 team in the Central Division. But
okay, I didn't know this. Good to know.
Yeah,
I'm a huge Minnesota Wild fan.
Look, just let it out, Steele, and let it be known that you're not fully feeling this take. Although, let's just also remember the sample size. This man has never actually been a number one goaltender. So, I think you have been one of the proponents, Michael, of saying maybe wait a little while to see what happens in your draft. Take some of these names at the back end of your draft. Gustavsson might be one of them. But let's move over to another player that obviously is going to be on the goaltending market in Jeremy Swayman. 1-year deal, $3.48 million contract. The Bruins came in at $2 million. Swayman came in at 4.8. They settle here. I want to just throw it right over to you because I honestly think Swayman is the better goalie. Obviously, we're saying this in light of Ullmark on a historic season. He was the Vezina winner. We're going to talk about players to fade and hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Ullmark might be on my players to fade list. I think this is Jeremy Swayman's crease to take. What do you think about this whole situation and Swayman's value overall, Michael?
Yeah, I actually would probably rank Swayman and Ullmark like pretty similar this year. Like I think a lot of people will look at Ullmark based on what he did last year and will want to take him first. But I actually think Swayman is just as valuable, or as you said, could be even more valuable. I think if you look down the stretch last season, like Swayman was providing probably just as much value as Ullmark was. They rotated just about every game. So like, that's good. But again, I think that's the challenge when you have, like, it's great when these goalies have this timeshares and these 1A, 1B situations, because like you can draft different options in fantasy. You can draft goalies later than you would have in years past. But the downside is, are they going to give you 60 games? Probably not, right? Swayman's another guy that I think will probably be even closer to a 50-50 split than, Gustafsson Fleury we just talked about. So, and again, the other thing with Boston, how many players have they lost, right? Like Bergeron's gone, Bertuzzi, Taylor Hall, a handful of really key players, Orlov, like, I know they had a really great season last year, but, could they be a team to take a little bit of a step back? Maybe that hurts his value slightly, but again,
let's hope.
I think
let's hope.
I've been saying it for years.
So am I. I'm tired of looking bad.
Aging, but they never do. Last year they were just incredible. So it's hard to say, but again, I think it's one of those guys that it's going to be great value for you if you're someone that likes taking like 1As, 1Bs and kind of doing a tandem thing with maybe 3 or 4 options on your squad.
Steele, I think you're plagued by the old mute button on this one, pal.
I am plagued.
Although I'm sure your take is fire.
I am plagued by the old mute button. It gets me a couple of times, but I actually want your opinion on this. So who would you have ranked higher between Gustavsson and Swayman heading into next season?
That's a tough one.
I would probably give a slight edge to Gustavsson. I think just because I think of I think they're so similar, but I think Gustavsson might play 5 to 10 more games.
A little bit more.
There you go. And honestly, at the end of it all, This is the ramp up to the fantasy hockey draft, that some of these takes you analyze now so that when you see some of these things in training camp and the lead up to the season fall through, you need to be on top of it. We're going to be on top of it all, including right after the break with Mr. Michael Amato of Sportsnet.ca and goaliepost.com to talk about a little bit of this Troy Terry situation and segue this Ducks conversation into players you want to target for the upcoming draft, players you might want to fade as well, and all of those in-betweens. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Take your first swing at betting on the MLB at FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right, just $20 down, and you land $200 back in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can be splashing on everything from the money line to the totals to who you think smacks that first home run, all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you get paid out instantly. There's no better place to bet on the MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Sign up today. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball.
And thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. We are a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where you can find your favorite team from all 4 major sports leagues, including the NCAA. So make sure you hit the subscribe, hit the follow button. It's your team every single day on the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. We appreciate all of our listeners out there. We appreciate Michael for joining us once again, the goalie guru, helping us with all the fantasy insight and input for this upcoming season. And before we move on to players to target, players to fade, I wanted to ask you this, Michael, real quick about Troy Terry and but the potential arbitration that's going on with Anaheim. So Anaheim comes in at $4.5 million. Troy Terry comes in at $8 million. First part of the question is, what do you think Terry actually deserves contract wise and term wise, after back-to-back 60 plus seasons and 75 games the last 2 years, as well as what do you believe his fantasy value will be into next season as well?
Well, I think, the thing with these arbitration cases, it just feels like a big waste of time because the team sets their price and the player sets their price. And they just land somewhere pretty much right in the middle. And again, that's kind of what I feel with Terry. Like, I would give him something in like the mid 6s or even maybe like high 6s. I think he's a good player. Like you said, the 60 plus points the last 2 seasons. He had like 2 seasons ago, I think he had that like incredible point streak that got him on the radar in a lot of fantasy leagues. But yeah, I think he's a ton of I think he provides a ton of value. I think, they're probably one of the more underrated lines in hockey, him and Zegras as a duo. And I'm really interested to see who is going to play left wing with them. I know kind of Adam Henrique has found a little bit of a home there, but I'm curious to see if Alex Killorn lands on that line because he actually had a couple of really productive seasons in Tampa. And I think a lot of people will look at him as going to the Ducks and thinking he's going to lose value. But I think if he actually ends up in that slot, I think he'll probably be I think he could have another 60-point season himself. So when I think of Terry, I think of a guy that, kind of elevates anybody who he plays with. So he's a pretty good guy to have on your roster.
Absolutely love that take, but I think this is just a perfect timing and nice segue into this conversation on some players that, of course, this is what we want to focus on. Some of the targets that you're looking at, Michael, in this upcoming season, young players or otherwise that you have your eye on. But I have an eye on a guy named Jamie Drysdale on this very Anaheim Ducks team. And I understand they were at the bottom of the league in a number of very important categories on both the defensive and offensive side of the puck. But Jamie Drysdale, to me, he's, not to make a horse joke, he's a thoroughbred. And I know that he was injured last year, but some of these pieces that they've brought in, I really think this team is in line for a come up. The back end is the issue for me, and I mean in net. I'm not going to talk about that on today's episode. We'll leave it for other episodes with you. But let me just hit you with this. Jamie Drysdale coming into last season, he's a 6 overall pick. He's only 21 years old. The injuries happen, of course, but in his year that he was a full season in the NHL, 81 games, as a 19-year-old, 32 points. What's your take very quickly on Drysdale? And then I'm very excited to pick your brain on other players you're excited for this upcoming season.
Yeah, I think it's a good point about Drysdale. I think that's kind of a mini strategy you can use in fantasy when a player's missed a lot of time with injury the season before, sometimes they get forgot about. And I think that might be the case for Drysdale. I think if you're in a really deep league, he could be an interesting option. He'll probably get lots of minutes, lots of opportunities on that blue line. But definitely if you're in a keeper or a dynasty and you're thinking further ahead, he's definitely someone to watch, I think.
Thank you. Plus minus might be an issue. Steele, let me just quickly throw it over to Amato, and then I'm going to let you follow up with the rest here because I've been talking too much. But if there was even one or two players, Michael, let's literally just keep it to your top one or two that you're excited about. It could be a bounce back. It could be a young player. Maybe, like you just said, someone we're forgetting about. Who do you have your eyes on? And I know you're tipping your hand early here. Check out Sportsnet.ca. Check out goaliepost.com and make sure you follow Michael_Amato on Twitter. Or sorry, that's Amato_Mike. My bad. But what are the couple of players that you're very excited about this upcoming draft?
So I'll give you two that are a bit off the radar. One of them I picked up last year off waivers down the stretch. He was phenomenal for me, and that's Owen Tippett. He had tremendous category coverage as a forward, even for things like block shots. He was really good. Hits, shots on goal. Like he scored a ton down the stretch. And the good thing is John Tortorella really loves him, so I think he's going to get a lot of minutes for Philly. Don't sleep on players on bad teams. I think Tippett's one of them. So if you're in a multi-cat league with a lot of different categories, I think he's one that can probably pay big dividends for you. And maybe another a little off the board, obscure one is speaking of players you might forgot about, Jonathan Drouin. I love the landing spot for him.
Sneaky.
If he plays, I think he's going to play with Rantanen and McKinnon. And I think it's obviously a little bit of a gamble based on, he's missed a lot of time over the past few seasons, but if you got a final pick in your draft and you're looking on someone to use it on, I think I would roll the dice on him.
That's definitely one of those sneaky late round draft picks. Flip and I were talking about maybe you take a chance on Jonathan Drouin because he has that chemistry. He's played before with Nathan McKinnon. So who knows? There's a couple of guys that we've talked about that have rekindled. I think Mitch Marner and Max Domi as well with the London Knights. So we'll definitely have to. That's very intriguing and might have to use one of my late draft picks for Jonathan Drouin out there. I won't try to snake you, Flip. I promise I won't try to snake you.
Sounds like you would, but okay.
I might. But the one guy that I'm really looking forward to next year, and there's a lot of fantasy value to have in the Atlantic Division. Before we move on to who we're going to fade for next year, I want to talk about Dylan Cousins a little bit because I am very excited to watch Dylan next year as the second line centerman for Buffalo. I think Buffalo is going to be one of those teams that could make the playoffs. Obviously, I did say that 5 teams from the Atlantic Division would make the postseason. But a guy, 81 games last year, finally scored 31 goals, 68 points. And he was only doing that with 16 and a half minutes of average ice time. So if he can get up to 17 and a half, maybe 18 minutes, all those other peripheral stats continue to impress and move up. And even those PIMs and the PIMs, the Banger League beauty in him steps out a little bit. So I'm very excited for Dylan Cousins. That's just the one guy I'm looking forward to drafting next year.
What do you think about that one, Michael?
Yeah, I like Cousins a lot too. I think key for him, he got a lot of power play one time last year. So even though he was on that second unit, he got that time, which really helped him. And I think you mentioned Buffalo. I think they could be kind of this year's New Jersey. How New Jersey last year kind of went from kind of not non-playoffs to like a 100-point team. I think the Sabres could potentially be that team. They're loaded, obviously, with young talent.
We have been saying that, I think, at length on this podcast. You're mentioning a couple of these takes as well as, and this is what I want to finish at for this segment, and I'm going to leave it to Steele now because I really have been talking too much. The point that you made about harvesting some of these bad teams for good fantasy value. These are the opportunities and angles that astute fantasy GMs look to. And I guarantee you, when you look up at the top of those standings at the end of the year, there are a couple of absolute gems that a GM has taken off a bad team that you went, wow, I didn't even think about that. So open your eyes, open those ear holes. Make sure you're following Michael Amato on Twitter. Make sure you're tapping into this podcast every single day. Steele, take us away. And we're headed into segment 3 here, players to fade.
We got to thank everyone out there for tuning in every single day. Thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. Once again, we are a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. You can find your favorite team from all 4 major sports leagues, including the NCAA, your team every single day. We appreciate all the love and support you show us every single day out there.
Mm-hmm.
Continuing the conversation, though, players to fade now for the upcoming draft.
Yep.
I'll just throw it over to Michael because we want his input right away. Michael, who are a couple, one or two players that you think are going to fall down the draft board and might want to stay away from in this upcoming year?
So I'm always cautious of anybody that just had like a crazy historical, almost unreplicable season. And, you know, a couple of those players, like, and it's not that I would avoid them entirely. It's just, I'd be very cautious about where you draft them.
Yeah.
And obviously I'll talk a little bit about like Erik Karlsson, who I think is phenomenal, had a great year, but to me, the odds of, you know, him getting 100 points again seem really slim. And I could see a lot of people in your league probably wanting to draft him in the first couple rounds. Mm-hmm. Again, I'd probably grade him as more of like a 4th or 5th round pick, just based on, you know, my thought that he's going to regress a little bit just naturally. There are a couple, I think we mentioned Ullmark earlier. Like that's another good example of a guy that had like an incredible season. Again, you know, the odds of him duplicating that with some of the players the Bruins have lost seem slim. So, you know, you're not going to probably want to take him over, you know, like a Vasilevsky or a Shesterkin or an Ottinger even. You're going to want to slot him appropriately. Obviously, if, you know, he's still sitting there after a while, there's nothing wrong with grabbing him. But yeah, I think just be cautious. Another guy would be like Jamie Benn to me. I think he had a great season last year, but kind of came out of the blue. It's those seasons that really come out of the blue, right? That you just want to be very cautious of. I'll give you one more name that I'm kind of,
please.
I think he's going to have a decent season, but I think he'll slide a bit. And that's Andrei Kuzmenko. I think he had like over 27% shooting percentage, which was unbelievable.
Huge. Yeah.
Almost got 40 goals. I think he's probably more of like a 30 goal scorer. So you're drafting that guy thinking, you know, he's going to be like an 80-point player. I think you might be a little bit disappointed, but I think he's more of like a 30 goal, 60-point kind of guy. But yeah, I think there's a few players like that. Again, it's not like avoid them entirely. It's just make sure you're slotting them in appropriately and for what they're probably going to get, not basing everything on last year's numbers.
And real quick before I throw it back over to Flip, because you're the goalie guru, you're the guy to go to when we talk about goalies. I want your opinion on Jakob Markstrom as well, because we saw last year he went really high. I believe he went in the first round in our fantasy hockey league. And yeah, he went really high, and his ADP, I don't know what his ADP was.
It was high,
but it was very high, and that's one of the goalies that obviously a very tough season overall for Calgary. It's probably going to be a tough year again. Heading into next season. But where do you think a guy like Jakob Markstrom lands after really just an abysmal season and very tough season to watch?
I think he'll probably go a lot lower than last year, obviously. Maybe he's just inside like the top 20 now in goalies you might want to grab. I think the interesting thing about Calgary is new coach, obviously. And like Daryl Sutter was very loyal to Markstrom, kept rolling him out there even when he was struggling all the time.
Too loyal.
Yeah. So I don't know if he's going to get that same opportunity with Huska there. He might have a bit of a shorter leash. I think the thing to watch there is, you know, they have Dustin Wolf, who's been incredible in the AHL. So I wonder if they're thinking of maybe moving Vladar this summer to pave the way for him, because I'm not sure it makes sense to send Wolf back for another season in the AHL. So maybe if Wolf can push Markstrom a bit, that might eat into a little bit of his starts, but we'll see what happens there. Yeah, I definitely would not be taking Markstrom as high as last year. That's for sure.
Wholeheartedly agree. And let me just hit you with this, because 3 players popped to my mind right away. Linus Ullmark was one, so we've covered that. The second one was Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, 104 points. And I understand that he got, I believe, over 40 of those on the power play, 16 or so goals. You know, I think it was something like, here, I got it open right here, 38 power play assists last year. So this is where I'm a little bit concerned with my prediction, because we know that power play is likely to go off once again, but I don't think I'm ready to trudge him out there as a 104-point man that I'm willing to take. Look, how many players had 100-plus points last year in the NHL? I guarantee you it was actually less than 20. So I'm not comfortable taking him up there in that first 20 players. I would actually like to take him maybe in the 4th or 5th round, but I could see a lot of GMs going out there and taking him early because of the Oilers angle, because of the power play, and because of his historically good season. So that was number 2 of the fade. And I want to finish it with this, and I'll turn it back over to you, Michael, for that take. And I'm a little bit worried about my boy Johnny T in Toronto. And I know he's been nothing but an absolute stud when it comes to actual point production since he joined this team. And I'm usually not here for the John Tavares slander because he brings so much more to the ice than the fantasy value. But the foot speed, some of the games, he's been very durable. He's had major injuries. I'm a little bit concerned about the quality of what you're going to see from Johnny T this year. So Ryan Nugent-Hopkins and John Tavares, because also let's look, 80 points for Johnny T. A lot of GMs will be looking at him in high rounds. What do you think about those two takes there, Michael?
Yeah, I think so. I'll try to play devil's advocate because
Please.
I think a lot of what you're saying is accurate. Like, it's good logic and it makes sense.
I'll take that.
But so, like, for example, I have a lot of the same concerns about Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, just quickly. But then I think to myself, I don't see that Oilers power play slowing down too much, and I don't see any reason why they're not just going to do that again. But like you said, I think there is significant risk with taking Nugent-Hopkins too high, because he's a good player, but he was definitely propped up by like McDavid and Draisaitl. But at the same time, like, they prop everybody up, right? Like if Connor Brown plays with McDavid, I love Connor Brown as a late round pick this year for that reason. So I think, it's good logic there, but I think the Oilers are one of those teams where, like, if somebody is on that power play, like, you're going to want to have them. So like maybe even if Nugent-Hopkins regresses a bit, is he still like an 80, 85 point player? I don't think you're going to be like too crushed by taking him. But I agree with you. I don't think I would take him in the first 2 rounds. But if he's sitting there a little bit later, definitely.
Like it.
Tavares. Yeah. So Tavares, again,
here we go.
Makes total sense to me. He's definitely going to slow down foot speed. What I will say is, I don't think he's the guy that really relies on speed a lot to get a lot of his points.
Good point.
He's really good around the net.
Yeah.
That said, is he going to have the foot speed to get into those positions again? I wonder if he gets helped by, he might have a better line mate this year with Nylander, and maybe it's Matt Nyes. Do they play Domi there?
They did play pretty good in the playoffs.
Yeah. Does Bertuzzi go down there at some point? Like, I think he might have a better second line mate there.
Good point.
But yeah, he's north of 30. He's clearly, we can all see he's slowing down a bit. So that is a legitimate concern.
Appreciate that, Steele. Take us away, brother.
It is a legitimate concern. I was going to bring up, as you guys were talking about the Oilers, I was going to bring up Connor Brown because I saw your tweet the other day. I'm always looking out for what you're tweeting, Michael, because you got some great
Good idea. Good idea.
Yeah, make sure you're following Michael on Twitter all the time. Fantasy hockey insight guru, goalie guru. We love having him on here. So thank you so much, Michael, for joining us. And thank you guys so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. Again, make sure you're tuning in Monday, Wednesday, Friday, going down to 3 episodes per week in the month of August. But then we're ramping back up to start September when hockey season is upon us. And again, thank you so much for tuning in for today's episode with Flip and I and our special guest, Michael Amato. Have a great day. Good luck with all your summer bets out there. And we shall see you back here again on Friday.
Peace.